So the North Koreans, as I said, they decide to stay in the Nonproliferation Treaty, but they claim now that they have a special status since they have this agreement with the United States. Relations with the International Atomic Energy Agency are difficult. The North Koreans are giving the IAEA problems whenever they go to Yongbyon. And then in April 1994, the crisis ramps up because the North Koreans began unloading the spent fuel in the reactor. The reactor had been operating all this time. It was the fuel needed to be discharged, and they began that process. The spent fuel contained enough plutonium for another 4 to 5 nuclear weapons. And this was a problem not only because it's a step towards separating that plutonium for potential use in nuclear weapons, which, by the way, doing that would not necessarily be illegal under the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty as long as it was safeguarded, done with IAEA being present, and the plutonium was safeguarded and not used in weapons. Obviously, the United States would not at all be happy with that situation, but the North Koreans could argue that it was not inconsistent with the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty. But the proximate reason why it was a concern was that the North Koreans were discharging that fuel while not allowing the IAEA to take the sort of measurements and make the kind of observations that would be necessary to determine whether or not that original declaration was correct or not. So the issue at this point is still, is the North Korean original declaration correct? Are they correct that they have only reprocessed less than 100 grams of material, or is it a larger amount? So the crisis builds. In June, the Clinton administration is considering building up military forces and evacuating US citizens from South Korea. That same month, former President Jimmy Carter, basically on his own initiative, without any brief from the Clinton administration, goes to North Korea, meets with Kim Il-sung, comes back from meetings with Kim Il-sung and says, North Koreans are ready to freeze their program at Yongbyon, put it on ice, no longer operate the reactor, not reprocess the spent fuel that they discharged, in return for us providing light water reactors and improved relations with the United States. This was actually something that the administration learned about over CNN at pretty much the exact moment that Secretary of Defense Bill Perry was briefing in the White House on proposals to build up US forces in Korea. So it took a few more months of negotiation, but in October the agreed framework was negotiated, which froze the program. And importantly, and often overlooked, the agreed framework changed the focus of concern and immediate attention from the past to the future. The past being that question of whether or not the North Koreans' initial declaration was correct. The future being the possibility of production and separation of additional plutonium. So the agreed framework put the question of North Korea's compliance with the NPT requirements up until that point on the shelf to be evaluated later according to the terms of the agreed framework after significant progress had been made on the light water reactor construction, but before the delivery of key components. So the agreed framework, as I mentioned, North Korea frees the plutonium program and eventually dismantle the facilities. IAEA to verify compliance. Spent fuel to be disposed of without reprocessing, which is a complicated and difficult task. An international consortium to provide 2 1,000 megawatt light water power reactors. But basically the North Koreans are holding the US responsible for doing this, although they're going to be South Korean reactors. The US to provide heavy fuel oil to compensate for the freeze. The North Korean argument is these reactors are for power purposes. We're going to freeze them, and therefore you need to compensate us for the energy lost. You need to provide us with heavy fuel oil, and we agreed to do that. The US gives assurance against threat of nuclear use, move towards full normalization of relations. The North Koreans are called on to implement the North-South denuclearization agreement that was reached in late 1991. North Korea to stay in the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty and accept safeguards. And as I mentioned, the North Koreans to come into full compliance with safeguards, meaning resolve that issue of the historical question of whether or not they have actually only got less than 100 grams of plutonium or have up to 8 to 12 kilograms of plutonium. They have to satisfy the IAEA about that issue before the delivery of key components for light water reactors. So that's a lot, that's a big agenda, all that in 4 pages in the agreed framework.